The Pelicans offense struggled at times this year, and I'm going to tell you why Zion Williamson, Brandon Ingram, and head coach Willie Green are to blame and what needs to change for the Pelicans next season. It's an offensive-focused episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go!
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with you on this Monday, another week's worth of shows here because we are not slowing down at all in the offseason. We're going to still look back at this past season for the Pelicans. We're going to focus on the offense today. I want to look at some key players, some key moments throughout the season this week too. And then we're going to kind of get into an off-season rhythm, an off-season structure starting next week. So a lot more to come on that. I'll tell you what the plans are. But I want to get into the Pelicans offense, do a little bit of a deep dive, a post-mortem on what went wrong with it this year, because it was disappointing, and we saw that kind of crescendo in a bad way in the playoffs as the Pelicans didn't score over 95 points in any single game. That was a real rough playoff showing from them, and they need to be a better offensive team next year if you really want to see them kind of take off and be a contender in the Western Conference. So we're going to look at what went wrong, what needs to change going into next season with that. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Monopoly Go. This fast-paced game lets you team up with friends for tournaments to unlock awesome prizes, unique stickers for trading, cool playing pieces, and hilarious emojis for taunting your friends. So download Monopoly Go now free on the Google Play or App Store. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this team, still looking back at what went wrong this past season. So let's start with the offense. And I want to lead with this. We're going to look at Zion, we're going to look at Ingram, and then we're going to look at head coach Willie Green, because I think there's different reasons why the offense just didn't work nearly as well. And their offense was ranked okay, 11th. That's near the top 10. You're basically in the top third at that point. But it really didn't feel like that the majority of the year. And again, in the postseason, struggling to score against the Oklahoma City Thunder is real bad. Christian Clark of NOLA.com pointed out that that was the 8th, you haven't seen an offensive performance in that bad in the past 8 years in the playoffs, is what the Pelicans just did. That ain't a good thing, and things need to change with that. So and Brandon Ingram said something that I thought was a little bit telling with that too, that's going to tie into all of this. Ingram said in his end of season media availability, they won games based off of talent, not because they were a team, let's say. It was individual players kind of carrying them. And I agree, the sum of the parts didn't create something that was greater than the whole. They feel like they underachieved. And so let's look at it through the lens of Zion Williamson, because I think this is important. It is inherently tough to build around Zion Williamson. Building an offense around Zion Williamson is also difficult despite how talented and good he is. And it makes sense, though, once you think about it. Point Zion is a real thing. That has what kind of carried the Pelicans to their offensive rating. But when he isn't there, the offense falls apart. Look at the postseason. And his availability going into this year had been a big question mark. So in the beginning of the season, the Pelicans tried to go with a different approach than this Zion Williamson-centric offense. James Borrego was brought in to redo said offense and not make it build around Zion. And it didn't work. Right? It didn't work. Their offense through the beginning part of the year really, really struggled. There was no rhythm to it, no cadence to it. We know about the 0.5 mentality, but that isn't an offense. That's just a decision-making process. That isn't how you build around cuts and pick and rolls and flow and all of that. And so I get it, right? The idea was, well, if Zion's going to miss a chunk of games, we can't have an offense that's going to be built around him, because if he's not there, then what do we do? So let's build something that utilizes Zion Williamson a little bit more off ball. And he had some pretty pointed comments about that earlier on in the year, saying he's just getting used to this different role. He kind of struggled in the beginning to fit in and to adapt to all of that, but it also just wasn't good in general for the team. Their offensive rating for the first 2 months of the season was the 2 lowest numbers they had. They really struggled for the first 20 games or so getting any sort of offense going, and they weren't a particularly great team because of that. They weren't horrible either, but they weren't the most efficient. They weren't particularly great. So when you looked at that, there was something that just wasn't fitting. More on that with Brandon Ingram and Willie Green later. But I get why the Pelicans wanted to go away from Zion, because if he's not in the game, things fall apart. But then they gradually shifted more and more towards Zion. And if you look at that, their offensive rating got better and better and better and better, particularly in the month of March, where they were one of the best teams in the league. February and March, this team was very, very good. And the data kind of bears that out. Even in January, there was a 3-month period here where this team looked incredibly efficient and really good and was winning more games than not. And that was once they moved back to Zion Williamson. That question mark of his availability started to go away. He was playing games. He didn't miss back-to-back games this season. And as they started to kind of just put the ball in his hands, let him go and do his thing, things just got better and better and better. It was weird earlier on in the year when they were trying to make Zion Williamson almost a complementary player rather than the guy that you build your offense around. There were many times where he was just standing in the corner doing nothing. More on kind of the tactical side of things in the third segment of today's show. But that's certainly not the way to use him. And once they just gave the best player the ball, things opened up. We talked about it a lot in the postseason, not drawing double teams, not drawing 2 to the ball. You're going to hear me use that a lot this offseason. Zion draws 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 to the ball, which means someone's going to be open, which means you just got to pass the ball around and you're going to get an open look. And that was how they generated a lot of their offense. But if he's not playing, then what? And you saw that in the postseason. So is it inherently bad to try and build an offense around Zion Williamson? And this is a question I'm posing to you. I don't think it is. Look, you went into the postseason, you didn't have Zion Williamson, you didn't win any games. I think that makes sense. The Milwaukee Bucks didn't have Giannis for the postseason. They lost in the first round. Look at the Memphis Grizzlies, who didn't have John Morant for the majority of the year. And when they did, let's not talk about it. They were trash. When you don't have your best player because they're hurt, because they're, out injured, you're just not nearly going to be as good unless you're, super, super deep. But I said all year long, I don't think the Pelicans are as deep as a lot of y'all think. So when guys get hurt, teams aren't as good. The Atlanta Hawks were 10 games under 500. Trae Young missed a ton of time. Chicago Bulls not getting much from Zach LaVine. They weren't good this season. All of that truly does matter, I think, when you look at health. In Oklahoma City, one of the healthiest teams in the league, 57 wins, right? Boston was healthy all year. They're also very, very deep. Indiana started to fade a little bit, even though they just won in the first round once Tyrese Halliburton started dealing with injuries. That's just how it goes, and you got to live with that. Now that I think Zion has laid a lot of those questions to bed about his availability, his health, do you feel more confident, comfortable going forward building around him? And I think the obvious answer to me would be yes. Part of this is I'm willing to go down with the Zion ship, right? If you build around your best player, a guy who is unique, changes the game, and then he gets hurt and you lose, I don't think you really did anything wrong. Injuries, unfortunately, are part of this and unfortunately hit New Orleans way too often. But if you think he can stay healthy, and be in the postseason, build around him. Don't kind of misuse your best player. Don't underutilize your best player. I think that's something the Pelicans really need to look at going forward next season. And given that there's going to be some kind of bigger changes, we think, potentially moving on from Brandon Ingram, potentially, then I think that is the direction this team should and will go. And look, if you miss Zion, you miss Zion, but at least you're building around your best player. Let me know what you think. Do you think they should go with a more open offense that isn't as Zion-centric, or do you think that's the correct decision? But let's also look at Brandon Ingram and his role in the Pelicans offense struggling, because that was who they were going to kind of make their point guard. And it didn't really go well for the first couple weeks, first couple months of the regular season. And Brandon Ingram had a weird year, talented and good basketball player, but the offense was a little funky from him this year. he knows that. He's acknowledged that. Let's talk about what that means going forward for the Pelicans. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Right now, though, I'm excited to tell you about Monopoly Go. And I know what you're saying. We need to call a penalty here, call a foul. You've already talked about that. But there's just so much good stuff in Monopoly Go that I'm going to keep talking about it. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for timed tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. There's the more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. And there's so much to get. Unique stickers you can trade with friends to complete albums. Cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with. Which is your favorite in Monopoly? I like the car. Hilarious emojis for taunting friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their own unique mini games, so you're always doing more, whether you're digging up treasure or using a robot pachinko machine. There's always new timed events to help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun and new to discover in Monopoly Go, so get off the bench, download it now free on the App Store or the Google Play Store. Again, that is Monopoly Go, free on Google Play and the App Store. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is also brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. It's winner take all in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. So right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. The NBA playoffs are going on. The Pels aren't in there. Make them more interesting. Get in on the action. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook and the official sportsbook of Locked On. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join almost 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. For your second listen today, Locked On Saints, host Ross Jackson, good friend of mine, saw him at Jazz Fest over the weekend, is breaking down everything post-draft, covering that team like nobody else is. It's awesome. Make sure you give Locked On Saints a listen. Make sure you're caught up on everything black and gold. New QB. Maybe. We'll see. So anyway, let's get back to the Pelicans here and looking at their offense. I'm struggling. Yeah, 11th best offense as a whole. Didn't really love what we saw throughout the regular season, right? The process just really wasn't great. They had some players just kind of dragging them to wins. That's good. Get your wins. But you need to make something work a little bit more if you want to take the next step, and that's not what the Pelicans did this season. So we just talked about how building around Zion is a little bit tough because if he's not there, things fall apart. But truthfully, I think that's the case for any team with any star player. Joel Embiid and the Sixers, he was hurt, right? He did what he could, but he wasn't healthy, and they lost because of it. And what was an awesome series. So that's how it goes, I think. If you go down, like going down with the Joel Embiid ship, there's nothing wrong with that. Going down with the John Morant ship, nothing's wrong with that. I think that's what you really are looking at here with Zion. Just lean into your best player, and if it doesn't work out, it just doesn't work out. But at least then you kind of did the right things. But let's focus on Brandon Ingram here. This is kind of the guy who's maybe the odd man out right now. And he had a terrible postseason. Terrible postseason. He acknowledged that. I think we all know. He had probably, and he said this, his worst season in a New Orleans Pelicans uniform. And I agree with that. Everything just seemed off from him this year. And part of that was, I think he just struggled to kind of fit in and buy into what they wanted to do offensively. And Ingram even, I'm going to sneeze. Sorry. Ingram even said as much in his postseason media availability. When talking kind of about the coaches and what went wrong this season, I think he kind of owned up to some of that, saying, I need to help the coaches more than I did. He did not do a good job. The coaches need to help him and the rest of the team. More on them in the next segment here. But Ingram didn't really do them a ton of favors. And part of that is just his play style and that mid-range game that he wants. He's a willing passer and is willing to facilitate. More on that in a minute, right? He was, I think, at one point leading the team in assists. I'm not sure if that's what the final number was here, or if Zion beat him out in assists per game, but let me pull those up here for all of us as I'm talking. Ingram was 5.7 assists per game. Zion was 5. CJ was 4.6. So he led the team in assists. He's a willing passer. He's willing to facilitate for others. But there's also times where he kills offensive possessions with some of those tough mid-range jumpers. And as this team wanted to kind of open things up, space the court a little bit better, he really struggled with that. And it comes to the three-point shooting. You know, if you look at his three-point numbers the past couple of years here, they're going down and down and down for the most part every single year, and that's not great. When he started with New Orleans, he was taking 6.2 threes per game. That's when he won Most Improved Player, made an All-Star. Second year, 6.1. Then it goes to 4.1, 3.6, and then it ticked up a little bit to 3.8. But to go from 6.2 to 3.8 isn't a particularly good number. The Pelicans coaching staff often talked about taking 40 threes per game, but that's what they said publicly. Their internal number, I can tell you, is 35 threes per game. And that was the number they wanted to try and take. They couldn't even hit that. They took 32.6 three-point attempts per game. That was 24th most in the league. And this is for a team that was 4th best in terms of three-point percentage. They simply needed to be taking more threes. This is easier said than done. When you have two high-usage guys in Zion Williamson who doesn't take threes and Brandon Ingram who doesn't take threes, your team's not going to take threes as a whole because those guys use the majority of your possessions, and if they're not taking threes, no one else really will. Zion used almost 30% of available possessions when he was on the court. Brandon Ingram was 27.2. Those were the top two guys in terms of guys who played minutes for this team. If they don't take threes, your team's not going to take threes, right? That's almost 60% or so of your offense, of your possessions. If they don't take threes, they won't. Now, Zion's not going to take threes. You don't want him taking a lot of threes. He hasn't proven he's a good three-point shooter. There's no reason for him to take threes when he's an efficient scorer at the rim. But Brandon Ingram is a good three-point shooter. We've seen it. He's lit up a couple of teams this year from three and then wouldn't take them next game. That kills your spacing. It kills your spacing. Look at how the Oklahoma City Thunder defended him. They were happy to let him get the shot that he wanted, those mid-range shots, because that is an inefficient shot. He wasn't trying to get to the basket. He seemed scared to shoot at the rim. He didn't take threes and passed out of open three-point looks. We saw it a lot earlier on in the year where he would just dribble into long twos even though he caught the ball on the three-point line. That needs to change. That's him, even though he's good at shooting those shots overall, is still not a great shot attempt when you look at the percentage and the expected points per shot attempt from it. Those mid-range shots that he takes are about as bad as it can get, and teams are happy to let you do that. That doesn't work, right? You need to be better about that sort of thing. His first year here in New Orleans, he took about 25% of his shot attempts at the rim. Year he won Most Improved Player. That number immediately dropped. This season, he took 15% of his shot attempts at the rim. That's 10% less. That's not going to get it done. He took 28% of his shot attempts from 10 to 16 feet. Teams are happy to let you do that. His first year in the league, or not first year in the league, first year in New Orleans, 35% of his shot attempts came from three. This year, it was 24%. That's an 11% drop. So shot attempts at the rim are dropping and shot attempts from three are dropping, meaning your mid-rangers are the majority of your offense. That's not it. That ain't it. I don't know what else to say. Zion's not a three-point shooter. Brandon Ingram can be. He just chooses not to be. But you need that space. If you want guys to do slot cuts where you cut down into the paint from the top, or even to do kind of cross cuts, jazz cuts, things like that, when they're just running from kind of side to side, you need space for that. When you're in the mid-range, you're not creating that sort of space. It hurts a guy like Zion Williamson. It hurts others too. And so Brandon Ingram not really kind of fitting into the role they were hoping from him offensively actively harmed this team's offense. And it got to the point, as I've said before on here, they kind of just abandoned what they wanted to do with James Borrego. I've seen a lot of people saying Borrego needs to be running the offense. What is he doing? They tried. Ingram didn't really fit in with it. And so if you have a player that's just kind of refusing to do some of that stuff, what else are you supposed to do? You can't bench him the whole time. You can't. He's too talented of a player. And they wouldn't have won all the games they did without Brandon Ingram. But there was just not the right fit there this season. You know, I have constantly defended the pairing of Zion Williamson and Brandon Ingram in the past. Every year I've done a show, it's like, no, they fit together. This year, when they were both healthy enough to kind of prove it, they did not, because of Ingram's play style, I think. And it even goes back to Team USA, where he just really didn't fit within that kind of team offense that they were doing. And it was just very awkward and didn't work out. And I think this is something that he maybe has realized with the postseason failures. Now, 2 years ago in the playoffs, dude was awesome. Something happened here. Something changed. And if he's brought back this year, and he could be, you know, if he's extended, I think he still could be. You know, he needs to take a long look in the mirror and do some introspection on this, on how to really fit in with this team. Because if he won't, there's no reason to bring him back, and you're going to look to trade him. And we're going to look at trade targets and trades and talk about all of that going forward here. So keep that in mind, that, you know, it could work out still, but I also think, given that he just didn't really fit in nor want to fit in, it was strange. Like something was just clunky, right? It's a feel thing here. We can point to the stats. We can do all that. You saw it with your own eyes, right? We saw it pretty easily that things were real weird and not really working with this group as a whole. And that led to them feeling disappointing in the disaster of a postseason. So if Ingram is back next year, he's got to change the way he plays and kind of go back more towards his first year here in New Orleans, when he was paired with Zion Williamson. Zion didn't play a ton of games, but that was the best version of Ingram we saw. It was an attacking the rim Ingram, a shooting threes Ingram. He has not been that person for a minute now. That needs to change next year if he's here. And if he's not willing to change, you need to send him out and bring someone else in who does fit better. Because you can design a great offense. Not that they did. I don't think they did. But if your players aren't going to try and fit into that, you're going to go nowhere here. Or you're going to end up with a season like this, which was good enough, but still leaves a bit of a distaste in our mouth with everything. So let's look at the coaching, because I don't think Willie Green was great on that. I think his tactics really are struggling, and I want to look at that because I think that's kind of interesting and what needs to change next season with things. And I'm sure there's a lot that people have to say, so let me know in the comments down below. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by DoorDash. You want to make your mom smile? Start Mother's Day with flowers or surprise her with gifts from the brands she loves delivered to her door the very same day with DoorDash. Moms are a gift, so give her the best this Mother's Day. Does your mom have a sweet tooth? Is she a tech enthusiast, a beauty connoisseur, or is she outdoorsy? No matter what she's into, you can make her smile with a fruit or flower bouquet, makeup, tech gear, workout wear, and more. And shop with savings that would make her proud. With a DoorDash membership, you'll save with a $0 delivery fee and reduce service fees on eligible orders from Dash Pass merchants that meet the minimum subtotal. Other fees, including service fees, apply. Terms apply overall, but you can save with DoorDash and make it a little bit better for what you want to get your mom. So get all of your Mother's Day gifts all in one place. Get 50% off your next order up to $15 when you spend $15 or more on your next flower, convenience, grocery, or retail order now with code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA. Order using DoorDash today. Terms apply. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast coming to you like nobody else does, looking at this past season, what went wrong with the offense, what needs to change for the team going forward. We'll get into trade targets in a week or so. We're going to do draft coverage, everything you could want. We have it all, so please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join almost 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we're looking at what went wrong with the offense here. We looked at kind of Zion getting hurt and that kind of just disrupting things. And with that, I'm just like, what else can you do? You know, Ingram not fitting in was definitely a big thing too, and not what we wanted to see from this team. And now let's look at the coaching. with it, because I think that is an area that leaves a lot to be desired and has a lot of room for improvement. I don't think Willie Green's going to get fired. I don't think he even should be fired. When you look at this, they just had the third best season in terms of wins for this franchise history. I don't think you run away from something like that. But I don't think Willie Green is particularly great either, and there's a lot of room for him to grow, and I think that's an important thing that he needs to do as well. Because if this team wants to take a leap next season, they can't have the head coach potentially holding them back. And I do think, well, there's a lot to like about Willie Green, the defense, and coming up with a good defensive scheme that fit a sometimes limited roster, no rim protection, right? But being a very good defensive team was great. These guys play hard for him. They don't really give up until you kind of saw him maybe a little bit in the postseason in Game 3. But there's also a lot to not like. Better tactics need to happen. Absolutely. It's just kind of tactical acumen. And I don't think it's as obvious as some people think it is, right? I don't think it was just play Hawkins. Like, that would have been a disaster in the playoffs. Playing Hawkins in the postseason wouldn't have been good, partially because they didn't develop him. That's a story in a conversation and a show for another day. But that wasn't going to be the answer. There was just no answer to a lot of what was bothering them in the postseason because they didn't have Zion Williamson. Kind of simple as that. However, one of the things you saw Willie Green do all year long was lean in way too much on these defensive lineups. And if you're an everydayer of the show, let me know if you are down in the comments below, by the way. One of the things I've talked a lot about this season that the Pelicans can be really good at is turning defense into offense, which then makes their defense better, right? These things are interconnected. They really are. And so you saw Willie Green lean in probably too heavily on defensive lineups. And I get the idea. Cool, let's throw a bunch of defensive lineups out there. We'll get stops, we'll get steals, we'll get rebounds, we'll force misses, and then we'll get out and run and we'll score. That's what we do, right? And we've said defense to offense. Yes, but there's a big but here. They didn't do that much, even with those defensive lineups. And I have the numbers here for you. You know, if you look at the Pelicans in terms of transition in the frequency, what would make those where do they need to rank to make those defensive lineups okay? Pretty high up, I would think, in terms of frequency of transition. But the Pelicans were exactly the middle of the pack. They're 14th. They're 14th out of 30 in terms of frequency in transition. They were 0.1% above league average. So basically right at league average. If you're just right at league average in terms of the times you get out and run in transition, those defensive lineups aren't doing it. They're not doing their job. They might be getting stops, but maybe they're not scoring, or they're just not getting enough stops to overcome the times that you would then have to play in the half court. If you're only getting out and running in transition 15% of the time, you're playing in the half court then 85% of the time. You need to absolutely factor that in, right? Like, that's an important thing. You need to figure that out. And New Orleans, when it came to half court, was, about 80% of their offense comes in the half court. It's not a great number, right? You want that number to be lower, and it wasn't for the Pelicans. So they're still playing the majority of their offense in the half court. So you need to prioritize that. And you did not see head coach Willie Green do that offensively. You saw him prioritize the defense. Now, he's a defensive guy. I get it, but it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. You have to adapt to what the current NBA is, and Willie Green, I think, has struggled with that this season and overall, right? If you're getting out in transition 30% of the time, all right, different story, absolutely, but that's not what you're doing. And I think one of the things we saw was there was enough data, enough just eye test of it to say, like, these defensive lineups aren't winning you the games, because if they were, it would be working and we wouldn't be complaining about it. But the fact that we're still complaining about it, late in the season here says it's not working. If it was the answer, we already would have known it by now. So try something different. And that's not what we saw from head coach Willie Green. And I think with some of kind of the, at times, arbitrariness of playing time and questionable lineups gets to the players too, right? That can create some grumbling behind the scenes, let's say. And I don't think there was a player revolt or anything like that. There wasn't. But I think that can instill some kind of confusion and lack of trust and confidence in some of these players towards their head coach. And that's not a great position to be in. It's not going to be perfectly harmonious every single time at all. But overall, I think you see that being a problem as well. But it's also how he uses players and doesn't use them to the best of their ability, right? You didn't really see Zion and Brandon Ingram in two-man actions together. Why not involve your best players setting screens for one another? Or using Trey Murphy and Zion Williamson in more actions. Now, they used a lot together, don't get me wrong, but it feels like that's the type of stuff that you could lean into a little bit more, and that's not exactly what the Pelicans were doing. There were certain players they seemed to run some actions for, Herb Jones being one of them. They ran a lot of plays to just kind of free him open in the corner for open three-point looks, and he nailed those. But do that more, right? Run plays if you need threes for Jordan Hawkins. And again, Hawkins in the playoffs wasn't going to be the answer. But use him more in the regular season when you needed some three-point shooting, when you needed a jolt of offense. Use Trey more, design more things for Trey, right? And they just didn't seem to do that. And it was only really down the stretch of the season where Willie Green seemed to have confidence in, getting rid of some of these inefficient players that weren't working, right? Benching Brandon Ingram in that Lakers game. Benching CJ McCollum in that Lakers game too. There were times when that probably needed to be done earlier on in the year and he wouldn't do it. And I don't know why that kind of came about so late. Now, he and the rest of the coaching staff is a little bit limited if players won't do what they want them to do, right? And when you look at, say, the postseason, the Pelicans missed wide open three-point looks. They just bricked shots that were good looks. And, they shot very poorly from the corners too. Willie Green can't make those guys hit those shots. He can just put them out there to be able to take those threes. And I think he did a decent job of that. And sometimes it's as simple as using this cliche. It's a make or miss league. So I think some of the blame he gets is a little bit overdone, but the tactical acumen there definitely needs to grow and use players to the best of their ability. That's using Jonas Valanciunas better than they did. They didn't. That was obvious, right? And, hindsight, they absolutely should have made another move at the trade deadline. Get Daniel Gafford. Just do something else. But you've got to have a head coach that's a little bit less stubborn than what he's been doing and be open to more changes and making other decisions. Because what he did this year, again, 11th best offense looks good now, but it was a real rocky roller coaster to get to that point. And there were a lot of lows there too with it. And you can't have that inconsistency because that's how you lose games you shouldn't lose to the San Antonio Spurs, Houston Rockets, other teams like that. And that's how you struggle beating top teams and getting blown out by them at times. The consistency needs to be there more. Might need new players to do that too. Might also just need players to be healthy like Zion Williamson. So let me know what you think about the offense this year. Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. And that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. We'll get into some Brandon Ingram rumors and some other things tomorrow too. Want to look a little bit more back at the regular season as well for this Pelicans team. So what some of the lessons we learned, 3 big takeaways, 3 things that we're concerned about. All of that, reasons to be optimistic, reasons to be pessimistic too. We're going to look at it all here this week on Locked On Pelicans, the #1 Pelicans podcast. So please subscribe. Join almost 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And as always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, and I'll be back with y'all tomorrow.